Hello and welcome to an episode of Historically Marked. I am Jason, and in this episode I will be visiting two very historic cemeteries in the state of Missouri, and they're both about half a mile from each other. They are both state historic sites under the Missouri State Parks banner, and the one I'm standing in right now is Sappington Family Cemetery, which is John Sappington, who is the patriarch of one of Missouri's political dynasties and one of Missouri's most powerful families during the first half of the 19th century before the Civil War. And two Missouri governors are also buried here. And then in the African American Cemetery will be slaves, well, some of them will be slaves that Sappington owned, but later developed into an African American cemetery on its own. And there's a lot to show you, so I'm going to go ahead and show you some markers and start the tour. And here is the cemetery, and there's some parking here, and of course it's surrounded by fields in the rural area. And it's about half a mile from Route TT, which is just straight up that way. But I'm going to go ahead and read off a little bit of this marker. So Sappington Cemetery is the burial place for Dr. John and Jane Sappington, patriarch and matriarch of one of Missouri's most influential families before the American Civil War. The 111 burials in this cemetery are direct or extended family members of the Sappingtons. The eastern red cedar trees predate the cemetery's founding in 1831. Their evergreen nature serve as a reminder of eternal life. The stone wall and iron picket fence were built in 1858. And then here's a picture of the John and Jane. John was born in Virginia. He lived from 1776 to 1856. And they married in 1804. And Jane was from a prominent Kentucky family. By 1819, they had settled here in Saline County, Missouri. His family achieved prominence and wealth through his business and medical enterprises. In 1832, he experimented with the bark of the Peruvian cinchona tree. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it was known for its fever-reducing qualities. From that bark, he isolated a compound called quinine, which he mass-marketed in pill form to treat malarial fevers. An education fund started by the doctor continues today as a college scholarship. And we will be visiting their grave. And then also down here it talks about the Sappington Negro Cemetery, which we will be visiting on the second part of this video. But here are three notable people from the Sappington family dynasty, and two are buried here. This guy is not John Sappington Marmaduke. He was Missouri's 25th governor, and he played a major role in the Civil War. He was buried in Jeff City at the Woodland Old City Cemetery. So one of these days I'll get around to visiting there. About Meredith Miles Marmaduke, I'll tell you more about him. We'll be visiting his grave, as well as Claiborne Fox Jackson. Two different personalities, but nevertheless they both served as Missouri governors. So I will go ahead and venture into the cemetery. This is the only entrance. And like I said, this iron fence right here, this dates back to the 1858. Wow. Now, Dr. Sappington is buried back there in the trees, but we're going to visit Marmaduke's final resting place and then on to Jackson's. All right, so here is an arch, and it's got Masonic symbols. I mean, some of the text is faded, as well as a lot of these older headstones that are in the cemetery, because yeah, this cemetery is definitely old. But so Marmaduke was Missouri's 8th governor, and he was the lieutenant governor under Governor Thomas Reynolds. Reynolds committed suicide during his term in office in 1844, but Marmaduke only served for 8 months to fill out Reynolds' term. He was not the Democratic candidate for Missouri governor in 1844 for numerous reasons, because he was pretty much an outsider of the party, and like I said, he supported, you know, the Union and everything. But one of his many accomplishments that year was to build a place for the mentally ill in Missouri. He wanted to build a lunatic asylum, and kind of bear with me on that one, that was what they were called at the time. Nowadays it's kind of non-PC. But he was driven out of public office But he would later be one of the founders of the Missouri State Fair, which first took place in 1854. So he lived a great life. And here's a, here, I'm not gonna go on top, but here's a little plaque. Yeah, he served from February 9th, 1844 to November 20th, 1844. Lived from 1791 to 1864. All right. Yeah, you can tell this is kind of coming off, but what can you do, really? And next up, we're going to visit the final resting place of another Missouri governor, Claiborne Jackson, or Claiborne Fox Jackson, sorry. Now here's the front of the monument. There's a quote that says, "Gather my saints together unto me." Lived from 1806 to 1862, and he was 56 years old, and his wife was 58. She died in 1864. So it goes without saying, neither one of them lived to see the end of the Civil War. But Jackson was all for the succession of Missouri from leaving the United States and joining the Confederacy. Now, he was beginning his first term as Missouri's 15th governor right when the Civil War began, and that was on January 3rd, 1861, when he was sworn in. But he was later driven out of office and into exile. He was exiled at Little Rock, Arkansas, and that's where he passed away in 1862. And it looks like somebody... Wow, okay, Boonville, Missouri, not too far from here, about 10 miles to the east. Okay, now we're going to go to Dr. Sappington's grave. Follow me. And as you were able to spot right away as you go into the back of the cemetery, yes, plenty of Sappingtons are buried here. I imagine this is their own row. I mean, I don't know how they're a relation. I imagine they're like maybe cousins of Sappington. Some of them have Masonic symbols on them. And the cemetery is well kept. I mean, there are some areas where I can tell they don't want to mow around, like here. But just looking at these old headstones is, you know, just kind of fascinating. I mean, a lot of cemetery YouTubers say that. But back there in that sarcophagus is the final resting place of Dr. John Sappington and his wife. Yes, he is widely credited, as I said, for treating malaria or malarial fever. His quinine pills, I mean, I don't know if they actually saved lives, but they did help treat malaria. And here's a cemetery stone that's been broken in half. I wish I can read it. I mean, the text is still there, but you know, you can just tell weather and time took a toll. And this, of course, is sealed, as you can see through the steel bars there. But unfortunately, the text is really hard to read, but it does say Dr. John Sappington is born in his birth and death dates. But unfortunately, I can't read the text below them, but we all know who he was. And you know, when you get rich, you know, a lot of times you become politically active and perhaps more powerful, I guess, at the local and state level, or so they say. But that was exactly the case with Sappington in the first half of the 19th century. But he was a power broker in the Missouri Democratic Party. And like I said, the Educational Trust Fund established by him continues to provide scholarships to local students. Now, I'm not sure about this open space right here. As you can see, there's a lot of empty space here, but I'm going to go ahead and make my way out. and we're going to go next to the African American Cemetery, which is just half a mile from here. And now I have arrived at the Sappington African American Cemetery, which is also a state historic site. And there are there's four historical markers. And of course in front of me is the entrance to the cemetery, but I'm going to go ahead and start over here where it talks about the cemetery that has served the African American community of Arrow Rock for more than 150 years. Most communities in Missouri had designated cemeteries for African American burials, continuing the practice of segregation. In oral history passed down through his family, Emmanuel Banks, one of 24 people enslaved by Dr. John Sappington, shared that the cemetery was set aside for enslaved people before Sappington's death in 1856. The cemetery contains about 350 burials, many of which are unknown. Any burials before 1865 were likely unmarked. After emancipation in 1865, generations of African Americans with links to the Arrow Rock community continued to use the cemetery. The eclectic variety of stones shows the community's economic and social status throughout its history, as well as its burial traditions. The simplicity of the cemetery is in stark contrast to the ornate cemetery for white members of Dr. Sappington's family, only 1/4 mile away, where we were just at. And then it says on here that slaves did build the famous J. Houston Tavern, and then also they cut and laid the stones for the gutters on Main Street of Arrow Rock in the 1850s, and yeah, they're actually still there. Also, the first African American church built in Arrow Rock was Brown's Free Will Baptist Church, built in 1869. We're going to find out more about that in another marker here. But African Americans constructed several buildings and features in and around Arrow Rock. Sappington African American Cemetery State Historic Site, along with several preserved structures in Arrow Rock, reflects the rich culture of African Americans and their contributions to Arrow Rock and Saline County. So before the Civil War, Arrow Rock was a thriving community because it was not too far from Missouri River. Like most river towns, the railroads threatened the town's economy, and that's exactly what happened. Many people left right before the Civil War. But by 1880, African Americans comprised more than half of Arrow Rock's population. Their hard work enabled a rich farming society to prosper before the Civil War. Arrow Rock's black residents made lasting contributions. However, segregation forced them to develop their own social and religious customs, schools, and even burial practices. John Thomas Trigg, the first African American teacher in Arrow Rock born as a free man, is buried here. He taught from 1890 until around 1926 as a competent, demanding teacher and a strict disciplinarian. The location of his grave is unknown, however. James C. Van Buren, the last person buried in the cemetery, which was as recent as 2012, was a noted American jazz and blues musician. Born in Arrow Rock in 1935, James was well known on American and European jazz and blues circuits, collaborating and performing with artists like Lou Rawls. Members of the extended family of Emmanuel Banks are also interred here. Ruth Banks, pictured below, was a historian for Arrow Rock's black churches. Robert Banks was well known in Arrow Rock for the corn shuck rope chairs that he crafted. That's a picture of Ruth. And this is a picture of James Van Buren. And then here is John Thomas Trigg, the first African American teacher in Arrow Rock. All right, we're going to check out a couple more markers over here. And there's also one right over there. I'll see if I can get to that one. But this mostly is a map, and it's a map of all the interments or what they could find. But yeah, you can definitely like see like who's buried here based on historians' research. And again, a lot of them are unknown, like their burial spot, that is. But up here in the historical text, it says the cemetery has existed since at least 1856. At first set aside as burial ground for enslaved individuals, members of the Arrow Rock African American community continued to use it after emancipation in 1865 and into the 21st century. The cemetery had a board of directors that managed upkeep and acquired additional property. Although a 1950s fire destroyed most records, thorough research of remaining records has led to this burial list. There are many interred here in unmarked graves, or their markers have worn away, been misplaced, or damaged. This list is incomplete. Okay. And I was questioning that. I was like, well, is this really a complete list? But if anybody does have any information about a loved one to add, please visit with the staff of Arrow Rock State Historic Site. And then it just shows where to locate the individuals here. Talks about notable African Americans in Saline County. None of the 4 people that are mentioned on the marker are buried here. I'll read about them anyway. The 1860 census shows 15,000 people living in Saline County, 5,000 of them whom were enslaved African Americans. The collapse of the hemp market and emancipation in 1865 resulted in many African Americans leaving farms and plantations. Many freedmen formed all-black settlements. 2 nearby examples are Pennytown, located 12 miles southwest of Arrow Rock, and Cow Creek to the northwest. Separating themselves did not free them from harsh, discriminatory, and sometimes violent treatment. The African Americans of Saline County would endure adversity and yet make significant contributions to their communities and the nation. This talks about William Henry Joseph Cutter Brown, who was known as one of the most famous cakewalkers. And cakewalking is a form of dance, and it gave rise to ragtime music, which was a precursor to jazz. But he lived from possibly 1835 to 1905. Josephine Jackson Lawrence was a historian who collected most of the town's history. She lived from 1929 to 1992. And James Milton Turner, who was born into slavery in St. Louis County in 1839, freed in 1843, and then he was later hired by the Freedmen's Bureau to investigate the condition of black education in Missouri. He arrived in Arrow Rock on November 7th, 1869, to look into the disappearance of funds dedicated to building a school for blacks. School board president Henry Wilhelm said the board never received the funds. Wilhelm offered to open a school in a colored church building now in course of erection. Turner saw that the school opened in Brown's Chapel Free Will Baptist Church. He was also the first to serve as a United States diplomat as the ambassador to Liberia. Turner was also appointed by Missouri Governor Thomas Fletcher as Assistant State Superintendent of Missouri Schools in order to set up schools in Missouri for African Americans. And lastly, Jacob Montgomery, who was enslaved by James Montgomery of Brownsville, which is now Sweet Springs, was a powerful minister. During the 1830s, he preached to black and white audiences across Saline County. Although described by scoffers as a poor, illiterate black man, he successfully converted many of his critics, impressing them with the force and effect with which he preached. Now we're going to go into the cemetery. And it just rained. It's been raining all day, so my feet are going to get wet no matter what. But I'm going to see if I can make my way over there to read that historical marker. But I'm going to check out some of these old graves. And I know I feel a little disrespectful because I'm possibly walking on somebody's final resting place. Here's somebody that served in World War II, Ray Parker. Born 1911, died in 1970. And here is that marker that was put up by the Friends of Arrow Rock Association. There are many of these around the county. This one is labeled as Sappington Negro Cemetery. It does contain the same information, like similar information, like oral tradition says that prior to 1856, Dr. John Sappington, pioneer Arrow Rock physician, gave approximately 2 acres of land to Emmanuel Banks, who was a long-time and highly regarded servant, to be used as a cemetery. And then it talks about, like, at the bottom, working initially as slaves and later as free men and women. Many of these family members and others worked as domestic servants, farm laborers, and skilled craftsmen at various trades. And they helped to build the historic community of Arrow Rock and made major contributions to the history of this area. I'm just going to do a little pan shot of the entire cemetery. But for those who are unmarked, you are not forgotten. Thank you for watching this episode of Historically Marked. I am Jason at the Sappington African American Cemetery State Historic Site, just not too far from Arrow Rock in Nelson, Missouri. All right, I hope you learned some history here, and stay tuned for the next episode. I'm Jason, signing off.